how does Qutb deal with the question of violence, its legitimacy, the means by which it could be used, the recourse that people can have? It's not as if the legitimization of violence is unheard of before this in Islamic theology and Islamic history. There are many, many issues and many times in which this arises. But in the modern context, is he the first theorist of violence in what we would think of as modern fundamentalist Islamic movements?
I wouldn't call him a theorist of violence so much. He did practice it. When he returned to Egypt and affiliated himself with the Muslim Brothers, he became a part of what's called the special apparatus within the Muslim Brotherhood, which engaged in violent practices, in assassinations and burning down businesses and so on. So he dirtied his hands. But what really distinguished him, I think, is that he began to enunciate a philosophy called takfir. Takfir means excommunication, the expulsion of one Muslim by another from the faith. And by so doing, one can justify their killing. Now, what happened? Why did this happen? When Qutb was in those Egyptian prisons, in Torah, one of the prisons, he was in hospital. He was a sickly individual much of his life. And Nasser's police went into the prison, and a lot of the Muslim brothers were concentrated in one large cell, and they just opened fire on them, shot them down. Many of them were killed, others were wounded. The wounded were brought into the hospital where Qutb was laying in bed, and he was appalled. And he asked himself, what kind of Muslim would do this to another Muslim? And his answer was, they are not Muslims. That became the philosophical groundwork for the excuse that Al-Qaeda uses to wage war on other Muslims, anyone who gets in their way.
Is this a point also in terms of thinking about Qutb? He's not a traditional Islamic scholar.
No.
Yet he has many opinions in his various books that stirred his followers to go along with them. But the emergence of this kind of a public thinker is also an important difference as we see the emergence of Al-Qaeda later. Bin Laden, Zawahiri, many of the others, these are not theologians who have the official ability to make these kinds of declarations, and yet they do quite freely, and they have a following for these views. Is Qutb, in your mind, sort of the role model for that, someone who is well-versed and well-read in Islamic theology, but is not a formal theologian, and yet is declaring fatwas and other things that would have been the province of theologians in an earlier time?
I think that's a good point, Cliff. You know, he wrote a commentary, multi-volume commentary on the Quran. This is something that imams are supposed to do. You know, it's the province of the clergy. But he was a wonderful writer. And even to this day in Saudi Arabia, on Fridays, there are usually excerpts from his multi-volume book, In the Shade of the Quran, sort of inspirational messages. Because of his talent, because of his intellect, he sort of overrode the traditional boundaries between the clergy and the layman. And I do think it entitled others to follow his example.